For the brace double hand Farley push, you've got two key versions, one that you see all the time, particularly the Yao brothers, where you're doing push hands and you make someone lean forward, you pull them forward and then their torso is on a bit of an angle and then you push them and you lift them right up off the floor and push them back, which does require strength, trust me. It's not just about some kind of magic chi or something like that. You do need strength to do that, and very often to make those demos work you need a bit of a compliant opponent who won't just wing you while you're doing it, I have to say. And to do that you just add in more rise, so it puts more of a compression set on the lead foot and you just add in more rise into the posture and just lift them if you can. But the version we're looking at today is the one where you just push straight back, and it's a little bit more practical, it's a little bit more the kind of thing that you do in sparring, and because of that, if you demonstrate it, it's never going to look completely perfect. It's always going to be rough and tumble sparring, the posture's always going to be affected by the things that are going on in the posture, so always keep that in mind when you're looking at demonstrations, but this is the one we want where you just suddenly push someone straight back. One obvious thing that might go a little bit chaotic is distancing, and you very often don't have a choice in that. Sometimes you and sometimes you don't, so if the moment presents itself where you need to push and you're not in the right position, if you try and move yourself in the right position, then the moment can be lost, so you don't necessarily have much choice over that. So you've got to adapt, and usually I always just think in terms of just do it and then think about the recovery posture. You know, ask for forgiveness, not for permission. But the other thing is, as you can see here pretty clearly, when you're doing push hands, for example, you make everything go towards your favour if you possibly can. So you try and position the opponent in such a way that you can get both hands on them, and both hands, you know, have a space between them, like you're pushing on either side of the chest, and that kind of maximises your structural integrity. And similarly, when we drill it on the bag, you know, like we're trying even on a smaller bag, that brings your hands together a little bit more, so it begins to make you think about that. But when you're sparring or fighting, well, people don't try and make it easy for you, they try and make it harder, and usually they're on one side, and it's a much harder push. So you can see here, if you're pushing against someone who's in a bladed stance, you haven't got the chest really to push against. You've only got like the kind of shoulder area. So what do you do then? Because it's a different kind of posture. So you have to adapt, you have to fuse. So you can see here, this isn't actually a double push as such. It's a fusion posture where my hands are crossed over, and it's incorporating a little bit of a forearm push with the other hand on that arm. So it's pushing against my own arm and both together pushing into the opponent. That's what you have to do, because there isn't enough space to get both hands on their shoulder and push effectively, or you might slip off anyway with one hand. So that's a posture that I drill that posture specifically that for this. And if you drill these postures over and over and over, you practice them on the bag, and then you bring it into sparring, get over your initial nerves, fears, whatever around sparring, eventually everything will start working. In any case, for the template posture, remember first of all that it's rear hand dominant, and this is important. This is where you need your theory, because you think, well, what do I do? Do I use open? Do I use close? Do I just like kind of close at the waist, like I'm kind of bowing forward? What do I do? And that's complicated a little bit, because to make the posture work, we have to use this kind of spine wave thing, a little bit similar to what's done in some kinds of Yiquan. And the answer is that you use close. So it's a rear hand dominant posture. It's very much like a cross. However, just to keep things simple, you don't twist as far round using close with the double hand push as you do with a cross. So it's about half the amount that you twist round, and by that point you've hit the target. So it's more useful in many ways just to think of it as being rear hand dominant than it is to think about it using close, because you can feel that much more clearly in your own structure, so it's easier to learn from that. So in this case, for example, I'm in a southpaw position. My left hand, my rear hand, is dominant, and the other hand, the right hand in this case, just adds a little bit of extra force into the posture, so it contributes to it. Now this will change if you want to push someone either side. So there are versions of this posture where you push someone over to the left or over to the right. And whichever hand is dominant, if you push them more in that direction, so in this case if I push someone over to my right because my left hand is dominant, the more my left hand takes over and the more the right hand has less to do with it. But if it goes the other way, then your lead hand starts taking over and the rear hand becomes less dominant. But it's a weaker posture when you do that, but it can be done. And the secret to do that, by the way, because I'm not sure if I filmed it, is to try and lift the bag or person up a little bit off their feet. And once they've lifted a little bit, and they usually a person will very often go with it a little bit themselves, particularly in push hands. Once you feel like you've lifted them a bit, then push them in the direction left or right. Doesn't always work, and sometimes people are just too heavy or the posture just isn't favourable to it, so you've got to adapt. Another really important tip, and it is something you can get these things training on your own actually if you just think about them, but it's something that you will experience in real life if you like the kind of things that I do where we're doing push hands with gloves on and incorporating push hands and sparring and stuff like that, is that when you push people and they're not constrained or the rules are different, so the whole point of what you're doing is that they should be fighting back, should be resisting. When you push them, just naturally their arms come up anyway, and anyone who's got anything about them will try and clip you as they're being pushed back. So don't just push and leave your arms out. You've also got to drill in, push and then what's next, push and then into cover, particularly cover for the push, because in that split second you will get clipped. So I drill that all the time when I'm practicing this posture properly. Right, so next let's think about the off the spot push, and the key to that, the gap Farley, clues in the name that there's a gap, so we've got that space to get up to our kind of maximum velocity for Farley. And remember, it doesn't have to be a massive space, it doesn't need to be a massive space. We can add volume with steps and things like that, but the Farley itself doesn't have to be massive, but there has to be that gap there. And this is where we really start theoretically and practically understanding this difference between brace Farley and gap Farley, which you see all the time, but you don't really hear anyone talk about, like in terms of theory, or if you hadn't heard anyone talk about it, you maybe wouldn't even notice that there's this difference. So where do we put that gap? If we've got our hands on our opponent, so we haven't got that gap, what do we do? And of course, we've got to bring that gap into the body, into the body's own movement. If you look carefully here, you can see that that's exactly what's happening. Every little bit of the body that's involved that can possibly just kind of curl back a little bit into this kind of wave posture is doing so to recreate that space within the movement of the body itself. Some of it we can't avoid being pre-movement, that's just the way it is, the way we use that kind of spine wave posture. Some of it has got to be pre-movement, but some of it we can very cleverly disguise in the push itself, and this is a great example. So if you watch very carefully here, you can see that the first part of the posture is that the rear shoulder comes forward and the body's starting to fold into the posture. So as the rear shoulder comes forward, the rear arm bends at the crook of the elbow, and that's beginning to put more stored force into that arm. At the same time, you also crook the lead arm. So in that very first moment where you're moving into the target, you're initiating the push, you're already creating more stored force, more curvature of the joints. Next, you need to remember something that we've looked at before, which is where you release force forwards with the torso, it creates a compression set on the lead foot, so you'll feel all your energy. This is the next thing to feel all your energy kind of push down into the floor. And this is why, although Wang Xianjia initially talks about like power coming up from the floor, where he's actually copying someone else's wording, according to Brennan translations anyway, later on he's talking about rebound energy, which is a much more accurate idea. It's actually the structure kind of locking into that point rather than any energy coming up from the floor, which is a kind of superstitious idea. And you can experience this yourself pretty easily. Just try first of all doing the posture without any kind of routing or setting of the posture, just from the arms and the torso. And you can feel that you just push yourself back off the bag. And then just try pushing off the lead leg and the rear leg, and you can feel the way that the posture sets on each leg and which leg is doing what within the posture. Next, notice the knee movements. It's got to be springy, doesn't need to be too tense, but it's got to lock down at the compression set point. So it's got to be flexible forward, and then it's got to lock into that rebound posture when the posture sets. So while we're here, there's 1,000,001 different variations and ways of practicing these postures. Some of it we'll get to look at, some of we won't. Sometimes I forget stuff, and when I was looking at this really old footage, I remembered this old version of this technique that I've somehow forgotten in the back of my mind. And this is the same posture, but just continue on with the lead hand after the, in the middle of the posture, just push on with the lead hand to get a little bit of an extra push on it, which is a really interesting technique. So here's a few examples and one or two other things.